Today, we're heading to the Lakes region to cross high tussock country between Wanaka and Arrowtown. Let's talk about the Motatapu Track. Kia ora and welcome to The Tramping Life, a podcast about hiking in Aotearoa, New Zealand, or as we call it here, tramping. I'm Chauncey, and in this episode I'll talk about a specific track or hut. I'll give an overview and share my experience, along with the highlights and some practical advice. The Motatapu Track is a hard but rewarding 49-kilometre tramp between Wanaka and Arrowtown. It offers stunning views, but for a heavy physical price with almost no flat sections, just relentless hills. It's technically relatively straightforward to walk, but it will test your knees and ankles, particularly on the descents. The track is largely exposed, with long sections above the bushline and limited shelter. There are 3 20-bunk huts: Fernburn Hut, Highland Creek Hut, and Rose's Hut. These will be busy in summer, as the Motatapu is part of Te Araroa. The highest point on the track is the 1,270-metre Rose's Saddle, and there's around 3,000 metres of ascent and descent over 3 brutal hills. The track was developed in 2004 as part of the sale of the Motatapu and Soho stations leases to overseas owners Shania Twain and her husband Mutt Lang, producer of Def Leppard and Bryan Adams, amongst others. I walked it a few years ago, and getting to the start of the track was very easy. It was a 12-kilometre taxi ride from Wanaka to the Fernburn car park. There I came across a rather large herd of cows in a rather small area, which wasn't the most welcoming start. They're not my favourite animal to come across while walking, particularly when packed together blocking the track. Moving slowly and carefully, I got through, thankfully, without spooking them. Things improved in the Stack Conservation Area, following the river through pleasant bush. The track then started to head up along the side of the valley, far sooner than expected, which isn't a common occurrence when tramping. I arrived at Fernburn Hut. This relatively new hut made a lovely spot for an early lunch, and I had the place to myself. I came across 5 people walking the other way before reaching the hut, and I didn't see anyone else for the next 2 days. Intentions book made interesting reading as usual, with at least 3/4 of the entries from international visitors, mainly Europeans and North Americans. Also, about half the entries were from people walking the Te Araroa Trail. I also saw that somebody had brought a 14-month-old with them and spent the night at the hut. You're never too young to start tramping. The track to this point had just been a warm-up for what was to come, both in terms of effort and scenery. From the hut, the track climbed relentlessly, and I was feeling it after not having walked with an overnight pack for 4 months. The views behind me were increasingly stunning, though, particularly when Lake Wanaka unexpectedly appeared. The views peaked at the 1,275-metre Jack's Hall Saddle, with a beautiful panorama. From here, it got tougher, with a thigh and ankle destroying long descent down the ridge, to cross over a stream, back up another ridge, and down the other side to reach Highland Creek Hut. Thankfully, I arrived just as it started raining heavily, which continued almost non-stop for the rest of the day and evening. I had the hut to myself for the night, which was both incredibly peaceful and quite scary. It was less the thought of being joined and more the surprise of the peace being disturbed, which made me anxiously look out across the track for figures in the distance. It would have been grim and quite dangerous if anybody had been out there, as there is literally no shelter from the elements on the track. This is definitely one to do in decent weather. It was also quite cold, as there is no heating in any of the huts on the track, so bring layers. Arriving at 2:30 in the afternoon, I had a long time listening to the rain drum on the hut roof and enjoyed the solitude. There's something quite special about being alone in the wilderness, such a rare feeling living in a city. There's also something quite spooky about it turning to pitch black, with only the light of my iPad illuminating the empty hut. The night was varied, from total darkness and noises outside from possums on the deck, to later an illuminated night sky full of stars. Day 2 was one of the hardest days I've had tramping, finishing the track by covering 21 kilometres in just under 9 hours, which was 2 to 5 hours faster than the dot times. There's a reason this is usually a 3 to 4 day walk. Doing it in 2 days was somewhat masochistic. More wonderful tussock landscape awaited me today, though, heading up and down ridgelines with long shadows from the rising sun. The weather was pretty much perfect, clear and sunny, but cool and some wind to prevent overheating on the uphills. After about 3.5 hours, Lake Wanaka unexpectedly reappeared again behind me, perfectly still and glassy in the distance. Walking the other way would have been better for the views, though the sun would have been in my eyes. The views behind gave me a good excuse to stop and enjoy them while giving my legs a brief rest. The Motatapu station then opened up below, and soon I could see Rose's hut in the distance, although it took another half an hour of painful descent to finally reach it. The 3 huts on the track are near identical, so the inside was familiar and made for another great lunch spot. I could have happily stayed there, but needed to keep moving, which unfortunately, other than for the views, involved a near 600-metre ascent to 1,270-metre Rose's Saddle. From there I thought I was on the home stretch, but it wasn't to be, with some of the trickiest walking of the whole track in the final section running above the Arrow River. The track was often steep and overgrown with thorns. I realised too late that I'd taken the high route, when given that the river was at normal levels, I could have gone along by the river, which would have been much faster and easier. It probably would have resulted in wet boots though, and I wouldn't have had the views I enjoyed as I caught the final rays of sunlight for the day. Macetown was finally in sight when I saw the autumn leaves, and I reached the empty camping area in time to set up my tent before it got dark. This is my first experience of camping alone in the wilderness. I've always done it with others before, and oddly I found it less spooky than staying in the hut alone, fewer random noises. I did have an ideal first time though, with no wind and it was dry. Macetown was an evocative place to spend the night. It is an abandoned Gold Rush era town, about 15 kilometres from Arrowtown. Once home to 300 people, a school, a church and 2 hotels, it now has a population of 0. It was gold in the Arrow River that first brought people here, with over 1,500 people camping out in 1862 before the town was established. The gold was exhausted within a few years, but quartz mining brought life back in the 1870s. Macetown has been long abandoned, with the only reminders of its heyday being some restored buildings and mining batteries. I passed the buildings on my way through the former town, including Needham's house, which belonged to the old schoolmaster. Set in a beautiful spot overlooking the Arrow River, it was relatively sizable for its time, although nothing compared to today's expectations for a family house. The campsite is really just a small area of grass close to the river with a long drop toilet. It's free though, and if you're lucky enough to have the place to yourself as I did, it's pretty much perfect camping. Macetown is accessible from Arrowtown by 4-wheel drive vehicle. There are 23 river crossings. By walking along the 4-wheel drive road through the 23 river crossings, or more scenically, if not far more strenuously, by the Big Hill Track. This is a 12.5 kilometre track which lives up to its name, basically climbing over a 1,060 metre hill and back down. The best sections are definitely on the Arrowtown side. From close to Macetown, the track crosses 3 streams, which are too wide or lacking suitable rocks to cross without getting your feet wet. It then heads relatively steeply up the hillside to the saddle with views behind, before far easier walking back down the hill, or in this case mostly running, to catch a bus from Arrowtown to Queenstown to catch a plane back to Auckland. The highlights of the Motatapu Track: the tussock-filled landscape is glorious, and the track spends almost the whole time out in the open in it with expansive views. Macetown is an historic and atmospheric place to spend the last night on the track. To finish with some practical advice, take a tent. None of the huts need to be booked, but they can get busy during Te Araroa season over the summer and autumn. And there are no huts at Macetown, so unless you've got enough time in the day to get out from the end of the track over the Big Hill Track to Arrowtown, you'll need a tent. Carry plenty of water, as there is limited available along the track, and it can be brutal hiking the near shadeless track in summer. There are a number of river crossings between Macetown and Arrowtown, which may be tricky after heavy rain. On the Motatapu Track, there may be risk of avalanche across some sections between May and November. If you're walking from Wanaka, organise your taxi to Glendhu Bay the day before, otherwise you may need to wait a little while in the morning. There's not a huge number of taxis in Wanaka. Finally, do not underestimate the elevation gain and exposure. Although each day is approximately 15 kilometres, the sustained climbs, weather and lack of shelter makes this a physically demanding tramp. Thank you so much for listening to The Tramping Life. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please follow the podcast in whatever app you use. Tell a friend about it and consider leaving a rating or a review. It really helps more people discover the show. If you have any questions or feedback, I'd love to hear from you. Drop me an email at thetrampinglife, one word, @gmail.com.